Hi everyone, this is a Python tutorial on variables. Today we'll talk about a little bit about variables, how to use them for different data types. Hint, it's basically the same for every data type. How to do some indexing and slicing for strings and lists and dictionaries, and a little bit at the end about good and bad variable names, right? So this is a Jupyter Notebook. If you're not sure how to use Jupyter Notebooks, there's a little blurb here at the top of each of these beginner tutorials, but there's also a good video in the repository showing you how to use them. Yeah. So what is a variable? Basically, a variable is a place that we can, in which we can store objects, data such as number, string, list, function, class, module, right? So in Python, everything is basically an object, so you can store it in a variable. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. Basically, for us, it just means we can reuse some value or some values over and over again, and only change it in one place, right? So let's look at a simple example. Imagine here we want to create a calculation that reuses an object many times, right? So in this calculation down here, we want to reuse this value many times, right? And we can do that with Python by just assigning the value variable, any number or a string or any other object. We've just chosen 6 here, right? The value variable isn't special, right? We could have called this anything, right? We could have called it a bad name like thingy. Value itself is also probably not such a good name, but in this case, it's just some word that we're going to reuse, yeah? And when you're choosing your variable names, basically you want them to be clear to you, but also to people who are using your code, yeah? So we assign this value 6. We go down here, we do some calculation. This is just a random thing we made up. And we put value in, so it's value to the power of value plus value times 23, this kind of thing, right? And when this calculation is done, it'll compute all of this in whatever order you've chosen. So here you can see we've done these brackets, so it'll do that first, then it'll do this, then it'll do this, and then it'll add them together here, right? But it'll assign the result of this calculation to the answer variable, right? And then at the end, we print out this answer variable, right? So we can see if we run this with Shift Enter, we get 144.0 something, yeah? So why is this useful, right? So imagine I want 5 here instead. When we run that, we get 120, yeah? If we want pi, for example, we get some other number, yeah? So what's useful about this is kind of highlighted here in the next cell. So imagine we had 5 up here, right? At the very start, which is what we had, or actually it's 6, I think. But we have this calculation here, which looks kind of familiar, but we have 5 everywhere, right? And so not only does it become tedious if we want to just change it to 6, right? We can do a Control F or something like this as well, but eventually we start getting annoyed having to change them in all these places. But not only is it annoying and tedious, it's also a bit dangerous, because maybe you want to change it to 2, but then for some reason this calculation is so long you just forgot to change this and you get a completely wrong answer. Or what if you have to put in 42 as your value, right? And then you want to go back and change that. Well, I've forgotten whether this was this value at the very start, or is this inherent to my calculation, for example, right? So essentially, we use these variables because they are reusable and they're very clear. And basically, this is not very clear, right? So in terms of numbers, that's why we use variables, right? And we'll look at different data types now, right? So for a string, we can just assign this variable, which we've called message, to the string. We can do an integer here. We can do a float. We can do a list. We can do a dictionary, right? And all of these different variable names I've just come up with, trying to be descriptive, but they can be anything at all. So this could be red or something like this, but this isn't very clear, of course, right? But I'm trying to get across that these names don't have to be anything in particular. They're not some special thing that Python needs to know. It's whatever you want, essentially, right? And they're allowed to have lowercase and uppercase, numbers and underscore, right? And that's it, as far as I remember, right? So we can add variables together like so. These are our two variables from above, number 1 and number 2. And we can also then take the shopping list variable and index it, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, right? Which should give us these two print statements, 45 and oranges, right? So let's go a little bit deeper into first string, then numbers, then lists, and then dictionaries for variables. So for string, we have the famous hello world example. We set that equal to a message variable that we've just decided to call message, and we print out this message. And as you might imagine, it just prints out hello world. Each string has a length in Python, right? So notice that it returns a number. So if we want the length of a string, we just put len, which is kind of a special function in Python, with rounded brackets, and we put a message in the middle, or string in the middle rather. And we can see that has a length of 11, which is true. We have 5 for hello, 5 for world, and 1 for the space in between. Great, it's 11. But it's not only strings that have lengths in Python, many other objects do too. And if you want to figure out which ones have lengths, you can Google it, or you can just put whatever object you want inside into the length function, len. So with strings, we can index them, right? And by indexing, we mean we actually just grabbing a character from the string, right? So the string is hello world. And if we want the H from hello world, we literally just do message, square brackets, and a 0, right? That'll give us the first index, 1 will give us the second index, and 2 will give us the third index. And that's because in Python, we index starting at 0, right? So if we print that out, we get H, E, and L, yeah, which makes sense. So we get strings returned from these print statements. We can also use negative indexing, and this isn't something that you don't have to worry about straight away, but it's good to just know that it exists. So you can start from the opposite side. So instead of starting from 0, this H here on the left side, we can actually start from the right side using negative indexing, right? So you can imagine if we run this, we will get a D, right? Because we started on the right side of our string. And this also holds for lists and some other objects in Python. We can also assign this indexed string, right, which will just give us a H, because you're just looking for the first character in the string of hello world. And we assign that to some other variable. We've called it here message underscore index, right? And we print this out, and you can imagine we just get H, yeah? But it's good to play around with this stuff and see what is allowed, what isn't allowed. So we can also slice strings, right? So this here was just indexing. We were just getting one character from the string. But what if you wanted a whole part of the string, right? Imagine we wanted to get hello from hello world. Well, we could do that with this notation here. It's quite similar, except it has a colon in the middle. So we have one index on the left side of the colon. We have an index on the right side of the colon. And what it does is it goes to the string. It starts at the first index, goes up until the second index, and grabs that part of the string. So you can see that it goes from 0 to 5. This is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it doesn't include the second index, right? It goes up until the second index in this slice, right? We can also use this notation here, where we essentially leave one side of the colon empty, and that just means it goes from here, the start, or goes here to the end. That's all that means. So you can see we get HEL for the first 3 in hello world, and we get world from the sixth index to the final index, right? We can also do negative slicing as well, right? So let's look at an actual example, or as close to an actual example as we get here today, probably. We have a name here for our file. This is just called 001 experiment, and it's an RTDC file. And we've set this to a variable file underscore name, right? And you want to get the number of this file name. We want to get 001 from this file name. Now, you might already have an idea how to do this. You just go to the file name, you slice it from 0 to 3. We could also have written 0 here. we set it, in this case, we set it equal to a variable. It's called file number, and we print out this file number. So if we run that, we get 001, easy. And just to show it would work as well, this way, we get the same thing, 001. So with numbers and how we use variables for numbers, it's essentially exactly the same thing, right? We have an integer here, we set it equal to this variable power value, or rather power value is equal to this integer 4, value of pi, which is a variable we just made up. I set that equal to 3.14, for example, and we can print out value of pi, and we can see we get 3.14. And of course, we can use these variables together. We can say value of pi to the power of our power value, which, if you calculate it in your head, is 97, right? And of course, what's useful here is that we can change this. So if we say 6, we wanted to change power value 6, that we just get that just like that, just change it up here. And it's all very clear for you and anyone reading your code. Yeah. We can also, of course, use variables with any other object, such as lists and dictionaries, which we'll talk about now. So essentially, we have exactly the same thing. So we have a list here. This is just a list of colors. We set that equal to some variable. We've just called it color underscore list here. And we print that out and we get our list. And here I go through then how to index and slice lists too. It is exactly the same, well, almost exactly the same as dealing with strings. So you have the index number. So 0, 1, and 2 should give us green, blue, and red. And if we run that, we get green, blue, and red, which is great. We have here this first index, or the 1 index, being set equal to some variable. We store that variable and we call it here in a print. And it's just blue, which you might expect because it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. We can slice it, of course. We can go from the first to the third index in this list. Yeah, so this will output a list, and it's something I mentioned here as well. That notice how the slice here returns a list. Yeah, so when we indexed here, we got a string, but when we sliced, we got a list. And this is something to take care of and note. And errors will surely appear when you're working this kind of thing, and often for these very simple reasons, right? You might think, oh, I'm looking at this list, I want to get a few things in the list, and then you are treating them as strings in the next line, but they're not strings, it's a list. Yeah. And let's look at our example from before. So this example is just a bit expanded. We have 3 experiment files here, and we want to get numbers 1, 2, and 3. Yeah. So we set this list, which is just a list of 3 strings, equal to file names. We can look at the first file name by just indexing, and this should give us 001 underscore experiment. We can slice several of them, and this should give us from the first index up until the end, which will give us 002 and 003. And if we print that out, that's exactly what we get. Now, how do we get the numbers? So there's several ways with lists we can do this. We won't go into too much detail now about that, but here we use a for loop. Another thing you can use is a list comprehension, which there'll be another tutorial on. And of course, there'll also be another tutorial on these loops, this for loop, right? But in essence, you have our file names variable, which is just equal to 3 strings in a list. We go for every thing in that list. So for every name, in our case, in file names, and it'll do it one by one, starting at the start. We print out the name, and then we slice it from 0 to 3. And this is slicing the actual string, because we're actually in each string now. So this will get our 001, 002, 003, one after each other, and then print them out. And you can see that's exactly what we get. If you don't understand how for loops work here, don't worry. And there'll be another tutorial, and there's lots of great tutorials online. Finally, we're going to talk about dictionaries. So with dictionaries, it's slightly different, but kind of essentially the same as lists. Here we have a dictionary. There's a key value pair, 3 of them. and we set that equal to the my dict variable. We print this out, and behold, we get a nice dictionary. So how do we index this dictionary? How do we get, for example, this 7? We can actually do that by indexing it with the actual key. So in lists, we use numbers like 0, 1, and 2. Here we use the key values. Yeah. So to get 7, we use the key from that value. So if you run that, we can see we get 7. If we run here, if we just use 0, we can see that we get an error. We get a key error because there is no key in our dictionary called 0, because it's expecting a key from the dictionary, right? This would work if, for example, you had a key of 0. Yeah. And let me just fix that up. When we run, oops. When we run that, we can see now we have another key value pair here, 0 thing. This is the same, but then we actually get thing. And this is why it doesn't work at the start, right? Essentially, right now, there is no 0 key in our dictionary, right? So if you get things like key errors, this is what is happening. Yeah. Finally, I want to talk about, well, finally, I want to talk about good and bad variable names. These are very broad rules. So essentially, do not use variable names that are already keywords in Python, right? So things like float, integer, float, integer, string, dict, list, array, other things like that, underscore, get item, these types of things, right? And also do not use names that are ambiguous. So don't use the word string for a string. So don't do this. Don't do that, because if you go to the next line and you say, okay, was that a string? You're like, for a string, and for some reason it isn't a string, then you're going to be very confused, for example, right? Perhaps that wasn't a very good example, but essentially don't use things that you think might be very ambiguous for you in the future or for the reader. I say here you can use comments, of course, you can use comments to comment your code, but often you shouldn't need to use a comment in Python when you decide what variable name to use. Yeah. So this is a short introduction to variables in Python. Hope it's helpful. If you have any feedback or is anything that was unclear, please let me